and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this edition of our Next Wild Conversation. We're glad to have you all with us today. To start, I'm going to go over a few of our webinar features. All attendees are on mute, but we do welcome your questions. Please type your questions into the question and answer box that's available at the bottom of your screen. If we do need to restart this webinar for any reason, please check your email for a new link. And we are recording this session as well. As you all may know, you're here as part of Twin Cities Diversity and Practice's new initiative, WILD, our Wanton Injustice Legal Detail. WILD's mission is to harness the collective power of TCDIP's membership to remedy systemic anti-Black racism in the Twin Cities by partnering with and amplifying the work of existing community organizations. Today we have our moderator, Upasana Niyogi. She's an attorney at Greenberg Traurig, and she is one of our emerging leaders group representatives. Thank you, Upasana, for moderating this conversation. And with that, I will turn it over to them and get this program started.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Liz. It is my honor to moderate today's conversation with Sheila Nezhad from MPD150. Sheila is also a mayoral candidate for the city of Minneapolis. Before I begin, I would like everyone to know that Sheila is very interested in hearing everyone's thoughts and having an interactive discussion. So I want to encourage everyone to send questions using the chat function throughout today's event. I will also make an effort to save some time at the end for questions. So Sheila Nezhad is a community organizer and a proud nerd living in the central neighborhood. She came into community organizing as a young queer fighting for LGBTQ liberation, and in the decades since, she has been active in organizing for racial, social, and economic justice. After she got her master's degree from Humphrey School of Public Affairs, she worked as a research fellow for an LGBTQ think tank and later ran her own small business doing community-based research and evaluation. She currently works at Ricardo Levins Morales Art Studio and as a policy organizer with Reclaim the Block, with a focus on municipal budgets. And I got to learn something about her last week, that her personal motto is from the streets to the spreadsheets. MPD 150 is a community-based initiative challenging the narrative that police exist to protect and serve. MPD 150 is a participatory, horizontally organized effort by local organizers, researchers, artists, activists to shift the discussion around police and policing in Minneapolis from one of procedural reforms to one of meaningful structural change. Welcome, Sheila. Can you please tell us a bit about how you got into the work of procedural reforms, racial justice, and police accountability? Did you always want to do this kind of work? And how has been the journey with regards to community organizing around policing and racial injustice?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks everyone for being here today. So my journey working on racial justice work, I think, started by nature of my birth. So my dad is an immigrant from Iran, and my mom is a mixed race woman, Anishinaabe from Fond du Lac in northern Minnesota, and also Swedish and Norwegian. So from an early age, I learned what it was like to work across cultures and navigate systems of white supremacy in Minnesota, especially the time I was in middle school and high school, really deep in the war on terror rhetoric in the US. And so from a young age, I was aware of how people are painted as criminals or dangerous by the state by nature of our ethnicity or appearance, and not actually who we are or what we do. So I got into my current work, though, focusing on policing and building towards a police-free future. I was activated in the murder of Jamar Clark, and movement for Black lives. And I was finding any way I could get involved. I was doing work on the ground, but also trying to figure out how can I make bigger, longer lasting change. And I got looped in with some folks who are doing something similar to what you all are doing here today and having deep conversations. And I started especially working with my white neighbors and white family members to really unpack how we learned about this idea that police are here to protect and serve, and how that can be so different from what we've seen and what we saw around the murder of Jamar Clark and the reaction to protests after that, and really unpacking the idea of what keeps us safe. And I got into my work with MPD150 because actually it's the streets to the spreadsheets, and maybe back again. So in my paid work at that time in 2017, when I first got involved, I was doing program evaluation for different nonprofits and groups that worked on systemic change. And I would help them evaluate, how are we seeing change? And I wanted to get involved in something that was focusing on policing, going kind of a little beyond the nonprofit industrial complex's scope of change. And I heard about this group that was doing a people's performance evaluation of the Minneapolis police. And so I got connected with MPD150, and that led to my work today of being a policy organizer around building alternatives to policing.
Yeah. So talking a little bit about MPD 150, can you tell us a bit more about the kind of work that you do there? What are the issues that you are working on at present? How big is your team? And are there any similarities between the work that you did as a research fellow for the LGBTQ think tank and maybe at your own business as well? And do you see any differences too?
Yeah, thank you. So MPD150, we're cool because we are unique in our approach, at least from what we've seen. We did a people's history of the Minneapolis Police Department. So we wrote a history that has never been written in one place before. And what we did is in 2017, it was the 150th anniversary of the Minneapolis Police Department. Mm-hmm. And so a group of organizers came together and said, okay, it's been 150 years. How's it going? How's this model of creating safety working for us? And we did deep research into the origins of the Minneapolis police, which here, as in much of the US, had their roots in slave patrols and especially in Minnesota, Native removal and genocide, and then grew to being related to repressing labor movements and so on. So we traced back that history specific to Minneapolis, and we also outlined the history of attempted reforms over the last 150 years, which was really eye-opening to me. So I'm going to invite those folks in the chat to participate. How many civilian review boards do you think Minneapolis has had in its history? Just drop a number in the chat of what your guess is. Okay, Lucas says 10. Other folks? Joy says 1. Kristen said 5. Other guesses? How many? 10. Okay, you all are maybe more jaded than me. We've had 5, 5 different ones. Kristen, you were right. And each time, so there's always a call for more oversight of the police. We need civilian input. But each time these boards are created, they either have any power, real power taken away. So the power to hire or fire taken away by legislators or by the police federation, or they've been dissolved. Or even in the case, Rich Stanek, who was a former sheriff and I believe former representative, got a bill passed so that the oversight committees couldn't hire and fire anyone anymore. So it's histories like this where it's like, okay, the next time we hear a call for we need a new civilian oversight board, let's go back to history and see, has it been done before? And did it make a difference? And if we look at what happened in Minneapolis this year, right, I think the answer is no. And it's not just that we didn't get it right? We've tried all these different ones. We need a bigger shift. So that's maybe me getting into the weeds too much. But so we wrote this history, and we also wrote a history of people's resistance in Minneapolis and resilience and community-based safety models. And we interviewed current people who have to work with police in their jobs. We talked to 80 people. So social workers, domestic violence advocates, folks who work at shelters, all folks who have to interact with police, and asked, you know, how's your experience? How could your job be made better if you had someone else who you got to call? And then we mapped out some possible alternatives to building policing across different issue areas. So we released that report in 2017. It created a big splash. It actually was, so I'm running for mayor now. Back then it was another mayoral race and city council race. And it became a top question that people were asked when they were campaigning was, can you imagine a world without police? And several candidates said yes. Our current mayor said no. So since then, we've taken the report and this narrative history, and we've turned it into an art exhibit. We've turned it into a audio book. So if folks want to listen to it instead of read it, it's read by local poets. And we've been doing community education across the city and across the world, talking about what we've learned and how the histories of Minneapolis's specific history in policing can translate to so many cities across the world, and the possibilities of growing a police-free future. And we actually, as a group, so we came together around this specific project in 2017 and never had intended in being like a long-lasting organization. We came together to do this report and then get it out into the world, and then we were going to sunset or disband, and we're all part of other groups as well. So we were supposed to disband last spring, but then COVID hit, so we said, okay, we're gonna delay our launch party. And I think it was the universe kind of looking out for us, of saying, don't disband yet, because after the murder of George Floyd, we exploded into visibility and became a resource for people, not just across the country, but internationally. We had our frequently asked questions about a police-free future translated into, I think, 15 different languages and put out in pamphlets across the world. So now we are still planning on wrapping up probably in another year, but our current work is getting our report out in as many places as possible. And this summer we used some of the funding that came in from outside donors to expand the report to include a curriculum that people can use as like a discussion guide, or teachers can use. It includes a case study of how we did our work and how a horizontally organized narrative-based approach can work, and artwork, some articles we've published in publications. It's just so awesome. We're trying to get it out. We have 25,000 copies, so it can go everywhere in the world. And for my work, you know, I came to MPD150 because, so I went to public policy school and wanted to create change, got started as a queer person fighting for LGBT rights, and really saw the importance of shifting laws and policies to protect our folks. But then I went on to work at the think tank. It was at the UCLA School of Law in the Williams Institute. And I found that a lot of the work I did was not actually making it to the people on the ground, right? I would work on a report that was part of my boss's journey to getting tenure, and it would get published and it would be behind a JSTOR paywall. And I'd have to, you know, just give the executive summary to my friends who were working in a nonprofit or working in an unaffiliated group on the ground. And I just felt like I wasn't able to actually work with people who are doing change on the ground. So when I heard of MPD150, I thought, okay, I can use my research skills to actually get things done. And we've had so many people really say that the way that they think about policing and safety has shifted through this story-based approach, much more so than just statistics or whatever. Yeah, and to answer your question of how big our team is, right now there's about 6 to 8 of us, depending on other people's work schedules. We're all volunteers, so we come in and out, and we all do a little bit of everything too. No one has like a specific job. We just all, whatever someone feels called to doing is what they can do.
Wow, that's how you get things from the streets to the spreadsheets.
Exactly.
I know you spoke a little bit about what happened last summer. I wanted you to focus a little bit more on that, the kind of work that you did with regards to what happened after the killing of George Floyd. I'm like you said, there's been a huge impact on the workload. So how has the support been from the organization and the community at large? Has there been more support, less support? And also the work that you've done, what kind of systemic changes do you hope to see come from the work that you're doing at present, and also the work that you did over 2020?
Yeah. So what we found is we'd like to think about our work with the report and the first few years of our organizing as planting the seeds of change. And after the murder of George Floyd, that really felt like the rain had come, and now the seeds of abolition were sprouting into real, tangible action. And I think, so what we saw is what we had always hoped to, right? And what is in our mission statement is to shift the discussion around police and policing away from procedural reforms to one about structural change. And we saw that this summer, right? It wasn't, the first reform or first demands weren't release the tapes or prosecute the police or new civilian review board or BCA investigation, kind of these things that we've seen in the past before are movements demanding in response to police violence. The demand was defund and abolish, right? And that systemic change, people were rising up and saying, no, we understand what the roots of policing are, rooted in racism and protecting property over people, which, right, we're seeing that in Minneapolis right now, downtown. And people were saying, no, we can do better. Like, we believe that we can build systems to care for one another. And I saw that in my neighborhood of neighbors coming together. You know, we made sure everyone had each other's phone numbers and knew who had pets who needed to get out of the house, if there was a fire or whatever, and all of this coming together in a pretty intense moment. But the beauty of that is it's carried forward into communities of care that don't have to rely on policing. And that was like the seed that we planted, right, with MPD150s. Imagine this radical idea of more connected communities who can care for one another and moving resources into the things that create safety in a broad sense, right? Housing, healthcare, access to clean air and water, all of this. So we saw just, I think we were actually in awe of the scale. Maybe we shouldn't have been, but we saw that happening. We got tons of requests, media requests from around the world, and lots of requests from other cities who said, oh, we want to do something similar, of looking at a narrative-based approach. What's the story of policing in my city, right? Because it's so personal. Even though the model of policing is similar pretty much everywhere in the US, it feels personal to each community, and the attempted reforms have looked different, and it's important to understand your history in order to know how to build forward. So I would say our work in terms of difficulty, it was a new challenge for us. You know, like I said, we were trying to kind of ramp down, and instead we ramped way up. And our role as MPD 150, we really took it as supporting the work of people who are resisting on the ground, and also the work of groups who were advocating for defund policy changes. So Reclaim the Block, which is the other group I work for in Minneapolis here, Black Visions, and nationally, the Movement for Black Lives. So we tried to boost that as much as possible. And I think the changes we hope to see this sustained belief in the fact that we can change systems. And that's part of what motivated me to run for mayor as well, is I believe that we can shift municipal systems, and at the city level is where this change can happen, right? We can experiment. It's big enough for us to see actual real changes across a community, but it's small enough that we can be nimble and kind of tweak the alternatives as we need to. And so I think we hope to see that people, even though we are tired, we might be feeling worn down, realize that we can't go back to the old models that we were using. We can't go back to policing as it were. We can't go back to creating a 6th civilian review committee in Minneapolis. We have to remember that another world is possible, and we're growing it right now. And we have to hold on to our history, right? And it can be so tempting for especially elected leaders to try to present ahistorical solutions. And so having that tangible, I should get my report out, but having that tangible record of our history can help us move forward into a future that we don't have to take to the streets and protest police murder because it's not happening anymore.
So every time we talk about systemic racism in community safety and policing, we use terms like defunding the police. You used it yourself, and abolishment of the police. So can you educate us a little bit on what these terms mean? Defunding the police, how different is it from abolishment of the police? And also what MPD 150 actually what do these terms mean for MPD 150, and is there any option that you support over the other?
So abolition, I'll start there. So abolition is not a new concept, right? We've had the abolition of slavery, and policing as an institution hasn't been around that long. It's been around for about 150 years in the US. It came around. And so abolition, what it means is it's about presence, not absence. So abolition is the presence, Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, of life-affirming institutions. So life-affirming institutions are those ones who help us make sure everyone has a home, make sure everyone has care they need when they are in emotional distress, make sure that youth feel cared for and taken care of, and have access to good education and green spaces, and all of these beautiful things that when we're walking around in the community or when we're at home make us feel safe. And getting rid of policing, the institution of policing, which is rooted in white supremacy and has continued to enact violence on Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. That's part of abolition, right? But we can't have one without the other. And I think the common misconception is that abolition just means, okay, we're getting rid of the police and all else stays as it is. But in order to have abolition, we need to build up those other institutions first, because we can't get to abolition unless everyone has their basic needs met and we've come up with ways of addressing conflict and harm that don't involve guns or cages. So that's what abolition means. And it's a process. And so defund is a tactic towards abolition. So what defund means is moving money from policing into those life-affirming institutions. And that's the other part of the side. It's not just defund, it's also invest. So the defund the police movement talks about, we have these huge bloated police budgets. So my area of work that I do for my day job is at Reclaim the Block, is looking at the Minneapolis city budget. So the Minneapolis city budget is over a third of our city's general fund. Now we're getting into the spreadsheets territory. So over a third of our city's general fund is spent on policing, and all of the other departments have to fight over the scraps that's left. And when people think of the police budget, they often think about that's funding the people, the police you see driving around the communities or who respond to 911 calls. But actually a huge portion of that budget is for things totally unrelated to beat cops. And it really has grown steadily since the rise of mass incarceration in the city. So increased militarization of police has come alongside the war on drugs. You know, we've seen these helicopters flying all over Minneapolis, similar things to that of riot gear, SWAT teams. SWAT teams really started up in the 1990s and are hugely expensive, right? The war on terror as well. All of these things have exploded the sizes of police budgets and don't go towards things that are responding to everyday calls for help from residents. So somewhere we can start in the defund movement is taking away from that militarization of police. So for example, the city has continued to fund $8 million a year for our special operations department. And that's riot gear, that's the stuff that we saw used to create violence against protesters this summer. Imagine what communities could do with $8 million. So that's a little bit about that. MPD150 as a group, we're an abolitionist organization. We believe in building up life-affirming institutions and that the roots of policing as a system are in white supremacy and that we must develop alternative ways of keeping one another safe. And I believe that's entirely possible within our lifetimes. And I think we're seeing the seeds of it getting planted right now. And it's not gonna happen overnight, right? It's like saying we would go to totally green energy today by shutting down all the coal plants. That's it. No, we need to build up alternative energy infrastructure in the country and then divest, defund away from those harmful, I'm going to say institutions, but groups, factories, etc. And the same goes for those who are working in policing, right? I think it's over 4 million people work for police departments in the US. That's a lot of people. And there's now conversation happening among different defund and alternative groups about using the concept of a just transition, which has been used by climate activists, and extending that to policing. So let's figure out what it means for people, especially those, you know, there are folks in the police department who joined because they want to help the community. So what does a just transition look like into retraining and doing transformative justice to transition into a role to serve the community, right? Yeah, and I'll stop there.
Talking about the transitory role, I think we have a question. The question is, do you or MPD150 see any function for what we now understand to be police within an abolishment model?
So what we now understand to be police are people who, I think, their primary tools are to arrest and incarcerate is the consequences of involvement with policing, right? or at the very least getting involved in the criminal legal system. And I think that any future society, as we build up alternatives to policing, will need people who are going to intervene in interpersonal violence and harm, right? As humans can do mean stuff to one another, right? And we're going to have to figure out how to deal with that. But I don't think policing as it currently exists as a model is the most effective way to do that. So I think we need more community mediators, people who know how to de-escalate situations. And just think about it like, if you live in a rural area and two people are fighting at the bar or whatever, and the sheriff is 100 miles away, how are you going to deal with that situation? Well, probably someone who has a relationship with those people is going to come in and say, hey, knock it off, or talk people down. And so part of abolition, moving towards abolition, is increasing relationships in community, so that number one, people feel cared for, and number two, they feel accountable to one another. And then there's also a movement called transformative justice that's sort of like restorative justice, but it goes one step further. And there's some great videos I can drop the link to that talks about ways to address harm. And the models have been used for, are being used right now for even really serious harm, like murder, right? And going through transformative justice processes for folks who feel like having someone who commits harm or violence going into the prison system is not going to make anything better, going through an alternative route. So I think we'll need responders of some sort, but I think responders whose tools are to arrest and incarcerate aren't in that model and aren't in my model as well.
Thank you. I hope that answers your question. So the trial of Derrick Showroom, it's starting on March 8th. So what is MPD 150's hope with respect to the outcome of the trial? What are your hopes personally too?
Yeah, so MPD 150 as an abolitionist organization does not believe that we find justice through the criminal justice system. That said, we are here to provide love and support for the family of George Floyd and what they would like to see out of the process. But for us, part of what justice looks like is listening to what Black and Brown communities are asking for right now, which is for healing and reparations, right? So the city and state have spent $35 million militarizing downtown. And our hope is that instead they spend $35 million on community, on responding to the trauma that was caused by police this summer, right? So that could look like pop-up mental health clinics all across the city. That could look like direct economic support. You know, people are broke and stressed out right now. And the way to create a peaceful community is by supporting people. I think my personal dream for an immediate response like next week is that the city get out there and provide hot food to anyone who is protesting outside. Because you know how you create a calm environment is by feeding people and put up some porta potties. I am a street medic, and so going out and keeping people safe on the streets, especially after the violence we saw against press and protesters this summer, I've been out there and like, people just need a place to go to the bathroom, you know, and things will be calm. You feel more calm when you know you can go somewhere to go to the bathroom. So I think using a loving, caring approach. So thinking about, okay, if someone in your family was hurting because of the murder of a loved one, how would you respond to that? How would you care for that person? How would you meet that grief? And we need to take that to the city level. And that looks like putting significant resources back into community. and into investing in the physical and economic well-being of communities of color in Minneapolis that have been historically divested from. And I think our hope as MPD150 is that, again, we keep this eye on the systemic demand, right? What's the bigger demand? What can we move towards? That's not, because we've seen over and over and over again that police officers usually don't get convicted in these cases. And also, it hasn't changed it in the cases where they do get convicted, right? Officer Mohammed Noor is in prison now, spends most of his days in solitary confinement because it's dangerous to be a former police officer in prison. And that hasn't gotten justice or changed things as well, right? So I think our hope is to keep our eye on the bigger systemic demand and keep pressure on politicians, right? To not use this trial as their one focal point of this is what we're going to do around changing and policing, because we know that the whole system needs to change.
Right. So what according to you is the most effective way to bring change? Is there a pathway that you or MPD 150 as an organization follows? And how can the community also, we as a community, help you in bringing about the change? Where should the community direct most of these resources to?
Yeah, I think the most effective way to create change is through changing hearts and minds, right? It's changing the stories we tell each other about and tell ourselves about how we get to safety. And I like to lead people through an exercise where it's like you close your eyes and imagine you are in a safe community. What do you see? And for me, I see kids playing on the street. I see green spaces. There's not potholes and not pollution. I know my neighbors in that space. I have a safe home. These are all the things that make me feel safe. I know I can pay my rent. Or maybe in the ideal world, there would be no rent, but even in the midterm, right? So I think that one-on-one conversations are the best way to get there. And that's why we included a conversation guide in our new edition of the report, so people can start at that relational level, and then we can build up from there. And I think we've seen a huge, like these conversation series, we've seen a huge movement across the country in people who want to have deeper conversations about undoing white supremacy. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where we have to start. And as far as supporting MPD 150, so what you can do is we would love to get our reports out as many places as possible. You can pick them up on my other work at Ricardo's studio. They're free. And even if you want to go around and put them in free little libraries around your neighborhood, give them out to your friends, maybe start a discussion circle talking about what could a police-free future look like? What could a future free of police violence look like? That, I think, is a great way to start. Right. And yeah, keeping those bigger demands at the forefront, right?
I think we have a question. So when you spoke about a militarization of the police, I think somebody had a question with regards to what about the people that only want to cause chaos and don't care about how others feel? If you can address that how we can combat these people and not militarize police at the same time.
Yeah, I guess I would ask Janice, why do you think, or who do you think those people are? Like, let's get really specific. Who are they? Where are they coming from? Why is it that they don't feel accountable to other people?
Right.
And answering those questions, I think, gets to how we respond. But there's been this portrayal especially, unfortunately, by those who have supported a lot of the repression against protesters this summer, of painting it as these wild anarchists are the majority of the people on the street, which, if, at least in my experiences, being with folks who are resisting state violence, that's not the majority of people. The majority of people this summer were a lot of young Black and brown folks who were so full of grief, right? And didn't feel listened to in any other way. And yeah, I'll stop there.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any resources at MPD 150 that you wish more people in the community know about? And who should we reach out to? Where should we reach out to at MPD 150 if we need help as communities of color or a person of color?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the resources, so the report is a great resource. We also have a frequently asked questions zine that you can fold up, or we can give you folded versions that are super helpful. It answers a lot of really sort of the first questions that a lot of people have that we've experienced, and has converted many of our moms and grandmas to believe in a police-free future, which has been great. So those are great. We also have an enormous resources page on our website that you can find videos and other books and other orgs around. And the best way to get in touch with us is info@mpd150.com. We aren't currently taking on volunteers right now because we are kind of winding down, but we do encourage you, and we can support you if you want to start up a conversation circle, going through the report over a couple weeks, if that feels good to you. Otherwise, there are a lot of other great groups and community that are doing work. You can check out Reclaim the Block. We're going to be doing a lot of community engagement this summer, and many, many other groups around that I can't think of right now. But I would say definitely start on the resources page at mpd150.com.
All right. I wanted to go back to policing a little bit. Do you see any replacement options for police that you advocate for? Especially, what do you see the future with regards to the policing system?
Mm-hmm. I think so. To answer that question, we have to get to what are all the things police are asked to do right now. And they're asked to do a lot of things. Even police in our reading and research say that they're asked to do things they're not qualified to do, right? Like asked to do things that we should have social workers be doing, or communities of care, networks of care. So I think there are some alternatives we can build up right now, like having mobile mental health response teams, which we fought and won in this last year's budget in Minneapolis. Was proud to be a part of that coalition, but we need to grow it to scale, right? Right now it only funds 4 people, which is not enough to respond. So I think mobile mental health teams is great. More transformative justice or mediators. So when folks are having interpersonal conflict, there's an option there. And then we have to start investing in prevention in a huge way. Like we need better sex ed in school that talks about consent and healthy relationships, right? Because domestic violence and sexual violence, the way that we get to prevention there is starting with education when kids are young, and on what healthy masculinity looks like. And then there are some things, parts of policing that we don't have to create a replacement for, like sweeping and evicting people from encampments, a lot of the things that are related to decriminalization, right? So we don't need a replacement for harassing sex workers, right? We need decriminalization of that area. So there's no one-for-one replacement, because there doesn't need to be a one-for-one replacement. We need to break apart all of these things that have been added on to policing over the years and figure out where we can grow new things and actually fund them so that they will be successful. Because what's happening right now also in Minneapolis is that we are funding some of these things, but not anywhere near the scale that we need for them to actually impact crime and harm that's happening in the communities, right? Like 2 teams of people out on the street de-escalating is not enough for the whole city. And we have the money to be able to fund them at scale, right? We can look at that special operations money that is there. The MPD's public relations department, their budget is $10 million. So we could use that to move into alternative response teams as well.
Right. And so we have a couple of questions, and we do have some time to answer those. So I'll get to the first one.
Great.
I'll read it out so that everyone knows. It seems like the public often cares strongly about issues relating to police violence when there are reports of police violence. But when there isn't any bad news, many people don't engage in these issues as much. Are there any ways for us to keep the momentum? Any events where MPD 150 and organizations that do similar work gather and promote relevant issues throughout the year?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a great way to get involved to keep that momentum going, and like, first of all, that's totally spot on, right? Even this year, we found in this year, the year of the worldwide revolution started in Minneapolis. In December, all of a sudden, it came into this crisis of we need more police. And it just felt, to me, totally wild when we think about 6 months before and not having seen any change. But I'm a budgets person, and I think every year our city budget comes up for renegotiation, and that's an opportunity to look at policing at that systemic level and how we're going to move resources into other things. So the Block runs an annual budget process. Tool, a bunch of other organizations that do like workers' rights, labor rights, racial justice work, housing justice work. You'll see them every year coming up with more campaigns of what needs to happen in the city budget. And so I would say look for those, and those are great pressure points too, right? Because there's a lot of attention paid in the media of what's going on in the budget that year. And the process starts in August every year. So I think that's a great way. I would also check out, just if you can follow MPD 150 social media, we boost a bunch of events that are happening around town all the time. Yeah, but I think it's also up to all of us, right, to keep the conversation going and having those awkward conversations with family members and coworkers, and because it's important. And when we keep that conversation going, when moments come up where they are moments of escalation and hypervisibility, we're ready with the tools to move towards a bigger vision, right? Like we saw with the MPD 150 report. When we were talking about it in 2017, well, there was an MPD police murder, but as the years went on, there were those lulls, but we were able to keep the conversation going.
Totally. Thank you for that. And thank you for your question, Joy. We have another question. This is from Lucas. Was there something in the historical research about the origins of the Minneapolis Police Department that surprised you, or that you think most people don't know?
Oh, yeah. Okay. I've got a great story for that. So right now, and it brings us to the present, because right now there's all this debate about a strong mayor system versus a weak mayor system in Minneapolis. And so if you go way back in Minneapolis history, it used to be that the mayor got to, whenever they were elected, appoint the police chief and all of the staff of the police department. So there was this mayor named A. Ames, and he appointed his brother as police chief and totally turned over all the police force. And A. Ames was super corrupt. and he shook down all the businesses in town to pay him and his family. And so he used all of the police as an instrument to shake down folks, and especially folks who were doing things like sex work in the community, or folks who were excluded from the traditional economy for whatever reason. And I didn't know about him. And so he was totally corrupt to the point where he and his brother, I believe, got arrested and convicted. And Ames fled the city and went into hiding in, like, I don't know, the Southwest somewhere. It was like back, you know, before the internet, you could hide a little bit easier. So he went into hiding, mayor of Minneapolis, former mayor of Minneapolis, for like 10 years, and then came back. I think he went to prison for a couple years and then came out and like lived the rest of his life as a successful dentist in Minneapolis. And I think that, to me, speaks of the depths of corruption in the roots of policing, and also, you know, political corruption as well. And to this day, his portrait hangs in Minneapolis City Hall alongside all of the other former mayors. Ames. Wild story.
Wow. What a story.
I know. Yeah.
Thanks for your question, Lucas. Does anybody have any other questions before I hand it back to Liz? Thank you, Sheila. Thank you so much for this conversation. Before I hand it back to Liz, do you have anything else that you would like everyone today to know?
Yeah, I think I'm just so grateful that you all are here and keeping the conversation going. And please, please, if you can, pick up a copy of our report. I think that it is such a powerful tool. And yeah, and if people want to connect offline about my run for mayor, I'm happy to do that. I can drop my email for that as well. But yeah, I believe the beauty of Minneapolis is that we're at the scale that we can create real big change to our systems of policing. And it's not like the scale of Chicago or LA, right, where we're essentially up against mega corporations to change things. Like the involvement of you and me and other people on the ground, we can directly change what happens in city politics. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for moving forward right now or backsliding. And so it's important for us to keep tending the soil of those seeds we've planted and making sure that we grow towards a better future rather than going back to the systems that we've seen happen over and over again.
Right. Thank you. I really look forward to grabbing some of those resources that you've been talking about. Thank you. And back to you, Liz.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining us today. As I mentioned at the beginning of this program, we did record this, so this will be going up on our YouTube channel after today. So please do feel free to check that out and share it with friends or colleagues who may be interested. Stay up to date with Twin Cities Diversity Practice by following us on social media. And we look forward to seeing you at our next program. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.